Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Katie. I'm the marketing coordinator for Waterworth. Just to introduce our speakers for today, we have Glenn Barnes, who's the Director for Water Finance Assistance. He has more than 15 years experience working with water utilities to improve public health and sustainability through better utility finance and management. We also have Sanjay Gar. He's the Principal Consultant for Water Resource Economics. He has over 25 years of financial and rate consulting experience to water and wastewater utilities with significant work in drought-prone regions of California. He is also currently leading the update on the water surcharge chapter in the American Waterworks Association, also known as the M1 Principles of Water Rates, Fees, and Charges. We have JP Joly. He's the founder of Waterworth. For more than 15 years, JP has worked with local government managers and directors of water and wastewater utilities, building models for asset management, long-term financial planning, rate setting, and other activities related to financial sustainability, including conservation and drought management and emergency planning. And last but not least, we have Greg Baird, who is the president of Water Finance Research Foundation and is also our moderator for today. He's a financial management and infrastructure asset management specialist for municipalities with water and sewer districts. He has also served as a municipal finance officer in California and as the CFO of Colorado's third largest municipal utility. And on that note, I'll turn it over to Greg.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think we're all here today because there's a lot of different issues occurring with water utilities across the U.S. And if we think about it, water and sewer, both utilities, must always be able to do a lot of planning to address some of these future long-term challenges. And it's really by understanding the future and being able to assess and model some of that information, it helps us to be able to actually address what many of those short-term issues are also. When we kind of survey and see what's happening out there with water utilities and their challenges, we can immediately understand that it's the aging water infrastructure issues. Billions of dollars of additional money really needed to be able to address that with asset management plans and all the synchronized planning that takes. We have leaking pipes, water loss that really accounts for 6 billion gallons every day in the US, and that's treated water. So very valuable, very expensive water. We also have the need or the issue of being able to finance all of the capital plans and the asset management plans and the emergency response plans that are out there. That's a major challenge and struggle that a lot of utilities are having. We also have water contamination. And even the new infrastructure bill and different things are really trying to address some of those water contamination and water quality issues. And the last component is really long-term water supply. And that really brings into the topic today dealing with the drought. We have, this situation where 40% of the United States, meaning about 50% of the lower 48 states, are basically in a drought today. California is 100%. The entire state is in a moderate drought. And we have climate change, but we have increasing demand on the water supplies. We have the different issues associated with each of these different major water supplies. The Colorado River flow has declined 20% in the last decade. Hoover Dam, a major player in hydroelectric power, is at 37% capacity. Lake Powell, another huge man-made reservoir of water for the Southwest, is at 33% full. So all of this water supply uncertainty and all of these funding water operations all go together to really say we really need to be proactive and we need to look at what tools we have to be able to communicate and calculate and work better to be able to provide for these water services, not only today, but into the future. And with that, we're going to kick off with our first poll question. How prepared is your utility to recover revenue during a disaster? Now, we can see what the different choices are, and with that, you can be very prepared, bring it on. Prepared but may face some political setbacks, somewhat prepared. It would take time and some revenue would be unrecoverable, somewhat unprepared, significant revenue would be lost getting the new rates in place and approved, and then completely unprepared, which kind of says, okay, does that mean I can get a federal bailout? So we'll take a couple minutes and have the audience tally up that. We have some experts here, and I want to basically, if we could go back to, let's see, the people who are involved. So I'd like to basically pose one of our first questions to Glenn Barnes. Thank you, Glenn, for joining our panel of experts. And I know that, Glenn, you work with a lot of mid to small sized municipal utilities. What are some of the long-term challenges that you're seeing that they're faced with, as you're talking to them and instructing them and working with different people in those organizations? What are they saying and sharing with you as far as some of those different issues?
Well, Greg, thanks for having me on the panel today. And I think it's a really great question. So when you talk about working with small and medium-sized utilities, just for the folks on the line who may not have an appreciation, when we say small, we could mean at times 100 people served or less, maybe 500 people served, all the way up to probably 50,000 is the range that I tend to work on with communities. So those very, very small systems, of which there are an awful lot of them in the United States, oftentimes it's per connection very expensive for them to provide water service. And so the rates they end up charging tend to cover more of the day-to-day costs of running the system. So they're going to cover salaries, chemicals, electricity, liability insurance, benefits for their employees, kind of day-to-day costs of running the system. But they're not necessarily putting themselves in a good financial position to replace aging infrastructure. So in a lot of the communities that I work in, we see infrastructure is getting older. They don't have money in the bank. They're not necessarily credit worthy because they haven't built up cash reserves. They wouldn't be able to take on debt. They're not really a good risk for a lender necessarily. And as a result of that, they end up having to push off the needed infrastructure improvements until it becomes an emergency. And when it becomes an emergency, of course, it's much more expensive to replace than if it is done proactively. And so I also think it's important to remember that in the past, rates, so the revenue generated from customers, has not always paid for that infrastructure. If you were fortunate in the 70s and early 80s to get a construction loan or grant, from the federal government after the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed, federal tax dollars paid for the infrastructure in the ground. If you're in a growing community, most likely you asked a developer, as that developer was putting in a housing development, a shopping center, et cetera, to pay for that water infrastructure that was then paid back through home mortgages in a way that it's not obvious to people that that was the case. Well, right now we're having to replace all that infrastructure primarily by paying with the rates that customers pay. So whether you save in advance and pay cash, or whether you borrow money and pay it off over time, it's revenue from your customers that is funding that infrastructure replacement. And for many communities, if they get ahead of the curve and want to pay for that kind of infrastructure replacement proactively, it might drive their rates up quite substantially, and you get a lot of affordability concerns.
Now, Glenn, a lot of these, smaller utilities, a lot of times they're just worried about, do we have enough money in the bank to be able to pay payroll and the chemical costs? They had the challenges with the shutdown and the epidemic and some of those different revenue uncertainty issues, and then they saw some higher costs on the supply chain. So what kind of tools, or what are some of those financial metrics specifically that they're going to need to basically be able to track? Because now you're not talking about just, do you have enough current revenue coming in? Now you're talking about, we have some different infrastructure assets, capital plans, emergency response plans that maybe we're going to need to fund, but how are they going to best manage that? And what are some of those financial metrics they need to start tracking?
Yeah, and Greg, I think you bring up a good point. I mean, certainly we're here to talk about drought today, but anytime you have a disruption in expected income or costs go up, as you know, as we're seeing throughout the pandemic and throughout some of the drought issues. And by the way, you mentioned all the drought issues. I'm in North Carolina, and we're in a drought right now, and there's a wildfire burning on Pilot Mountain, not an hour away from where I am right now. So, you know, we may not get as much attention as some of the Western issues, but we're having similar issues here in the East as well. So I think if you're a water utility, you need to be paying attention first and foremost to your operating ratio. So are you able to cover your day-to-day costs? You want to pay attention if you've borrowed money to your debt service coverage requirements that your lender has put on you. But you also want to look at how much money you have in the bank. So that may be something like, measuring your reserves, days of cash on hand, those types of metrics. But I think what's really important is if you're in a situation where things are changing, and certainly we've seen that over the last couple of years for a number of reasons across the country financially, things have changed. You want to make sure that you're really tracking, do we have enough money to pay for our day-to-day needs? But then, as you said, you're planning for the future. Hopefully, you've got an asset management plan. Hopefully, you have a capital improvement plan. If you're 3,300 people or above, you are required to have an emergency response plan. Hopefully, you've done that, and you're actually not just checking off a box, but using it to make investments in the system. There are going to be things that you're going to need to spend money on, and I think it's really important to have a model where you're able to look pretty regularly at your financial condition, your financial health, and how things are changing based on the current conditions.
Okay. JP, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Greg.
Hi, JP, you're with Waterworth. I know that, and I think probably Glenn's run into the same thing, but when I've presented rate or financial plans to water boards or newly elected council members, a lot of them, they're visual people. And when they just see financial data and numbers, and you're trying to get them to track spreadsheets and the interaction of all these different financial metrics, it's very hard. I mean, it's like you squeeze a balloon and something else, pops up over on another side, everything from, the debt to the current revenues to your CIP and reserves. How does the Waterworth model work, and how does that help in the visualization of being able to attain financial resilience, which is basically what everybody wants to seek after?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for moderating today, Greg. So let's do a little role playing. Let's pretend you're the finance director for a place called Desertville, okay? And it's a smallish community of maybe about 25,000 population. And what I'm going to show you, and I'm going to share my screen here, I'm going to show you how I can help you build that very financial model quite easily in a couple of hours, in fact, and provided you've got your data sort of handy at your fingertips, we can build a model together and we can answer all those questions that are coming up. So let me first break this down one piece at a time, not to kind of inundate you with all the details right now. And so what I would do is first we would talk about your expenses. And as Glenn was mentioning, you've got your operating expenses, and we would bring in some actuals for a few going back a couple of years. And then on top of that, you would probably tell me that you've got some debt servicing already in place, and you've got your capital plan. So you've got some spending in mind for the coming years. And in order to help with some of these big projects, you might also tell me that you're planning to borrow some funds. So there's going to be some additional debt servicing costs in the outer years. So these are all the expenses in the model, and they give you an idea of what your revenue requirements are going to be over the foreseeable future. And you can see that our model can go quite a ways out. Now, let's talk about revenues. So we'll start by talking about, your rate revenues coming in from rates. So you've got a fixed component and a commodity component to your rates. And then you might have some developer contributions. Here are those borrowed funds that you talked about that you're planning to go out to borrow. And there may be a number of other revenues. Once we've got those in, I would ask you about your cash, your current cash and cash equivalents, so we can set the starting point for your projected fund balance in the model. And we would get, so this black line represents that cash. And so what Waterworth is doing is it's helping you see into the future where your cash is going to be based on some assumptions and some decisions you might make inside of the model. And then we might have a conversation about your cash reserve policies. So Glenn touched on a few of those, and like emergency policies and debt coverage policies, rate stabilization, and so on. And that would help us set some guidelines in the model. So this is really the real trick to all this is for you to have a guide that helps you aim and decide how you want to steer that cash. And right now we're looking at a model that I would say is solved. So that means that right now your cash is looking healthy. You're starting out at about $15 million, and you're going to have maybe as much as 25 million for some years, and it starts to drop. So in this plan, you've got a really healthy cash model. And the solution to this comes about with, if I can go to the punchline, looks like you're going to need to do something around 6% rate increases for a few years, and then some 4% rate increases, and then it drops down. Now, suppose you didn't do those 6% rate increases for a few years. Let's look what an unsolved model might look like. And you can see right away that your cash is going to drop, not right away. So, you'd be able to absorb that for a number of years, but it'll drop pretty fast after that. Now, let's just look at a few of the metrics in the model. And so one of the things that, let me just go back to this screen. Let's suppose that we're looking at this, and I might say, look, Greg, you've got so much cash. Why don't you take it a little easy on the ratepayers? And instead of these 6% rate increases, why don't you drop them down to some 3s for a few years? And we can see pretty quickly that, sure, you can absorb that for a decade, and it's not really a big deal. But two things about that. First of all, if I come back to this screen here, Glenn might tell you, whoa, not so fast, Greg, because remember your capital plan, depending on how sure you are about, your future spending. And we can see that in the very out years here, we've got a pretty limited amount. We've got a small budget here. So, your thinking didn't quite go past 2033, let's say. And who knows what kind of big expenses you have in these out years. So you might not want to give up that cash so quickly. But there's a second thing that is going to be an issue. If I bring up the operating expenses here, and also your current debt servicing obligations, and if I compare those to your incoming revenues, I can see that your rates are struggling to cover your current obligations for a few years. And if we throw in the other debt servicing that you were planning to do, you can see that for several years, almost a decade, you would have a hard time meeting what might be called your debt service coverage requirement. And if I look at the graph that represents that, you can see this blue line here, which represents your debt service coverage ratio, which, as you know, being the finance director for Desertville, it tells you whether, what kind of situation you are in terms of further borrowing. And you're below the threshold. So you've decided that your threshold is 1.2. That's what your ratio needs to be, and you've dropped below it. So we'd have to go back here and return those 3s back to 6s. Okay, and now we're above the line, and now you're in a healthier position to borrow funds, and we've returned your cash to where it was. And all in all, the model at this point is ready to look at any number of other scenarios, which I know we're going to talk about coming up, drought scenarios. But let me say one last thing before I turn it back over to you. We can also look at looking at the operating expenses. We can see that Desertville, in addition to maybe having some of its own source of supply, it also buys water regionally. So it has a pretty high variable component to the operating costs. So 35% of your operating costs are variable because you're buying that water. Now, this doesn't include your debt servicing or your capital expenses. So if we threw those in as well, that 35 would turn into a smaller number. And if we compare that to your revenue structure, we can see that your fixed revenues are about 35%. So you've got 35% variable costs, but only 35% fixed revenue. So something to keep in mind as we think through and look to the future, and help you make decisions about what you want to do with borrowing and rates and your infrastructure plan.
Okay, excellent. Well, JP, I love the visualization there. It's very interesting because when you think of GFOA best practices, it's a 10-year CIP. It's trying to look out in the distance. When you issue debt, the credit rating agencies, they want to see 5 years historical and then a 5-year projected on how are things going on. So I really like the ability to go out long term, because if for political circumstances, if I'm trying to not create any rate shock, then if I can understand visually and being able to explain that, then I can adjust for that. But that model looks pretty intensive, and with all the visualization, I only have some information on some spreadsheets, so what would that take A to B to actually be able to demonstrate or see some of my data? If I was a finance director, population 25,000 with some spreadsheets, how long would that take to, say, populate this cloud-based model? And a lot of them are working remotely too.
Yeah, so generally, if we can get a couple of your financial, audited financial statements for a couple of years, and if you've got that your capital improvement plan in an Excel form of sorts where you've got your projects listed and scheduled, and if you've got your schedule of debt service payments that go out to however many years you've got left in the life of the loans. If you've got that information handy, and I know you do, they're on your hard drive, not too many clicks away. You and I would spend about 2 hours.
Okay.
After about a 2-hour session, you would have a model like the one I just showed you on the screen, and you would be able to start looking at all kinds of scenarios from that point on.
Okay, and it's cloud-based, and so it's protected, and that information's there. And if I'm in the office or at home, I could technically access it, correct?
You can share it. You can access it from anywhere. There's no software you have to load on your computer or on any servers at your offices. It's all just like you do with online banking or anything else you do on cloud, that's cloud-based. You just need a login from us, and off you go.
Okay, excellent. Well, as we continue on this conversation, and what Glenn said, yeah, preparing for disasters and emergencies like drought, but wildfires could come in and threaten your water tanks. And so a great deal of planning needs to occur. There's your responsibilities on the financial side, but a lot of the water management, it's not just in the finance department, it's operations, it's capital planning. There's a lot of different moving components that need to be included. So if we look at some of the definitions of water management plans, we know that it's a framework to help meet these long-term resource sustainability issues, to make sure that our mountain runoff that occurs in the spring, that we're starting to judge, our water supply, if it's surface water, and how many feet of water supply we have. All of those different items are captured in long-term water management plans for the water director to be able to basically make a determination if we're in a drought, what type of stage of the drought that we're in. And that stage declaration is really based on the status of the water system. If we look at the next slide, there's some other definitions that we want to include here for today's discussion. Rates and surcharges. Price, a lot of rates and fees are, prices to incentivize people to reduce water demand. And a drought surcharge is really that, a temporary fee to basically be able to make sure that the utility can meet all of their financial obligations, even though there needs to be a reduction in water demand through conservation or some of these different charges. And we separate drought surcharges from the typical rates, because the typical rates really need to be able to recover all of our normal fixed and variable operating costs both short-term and long-term. So drought surcharges is really that financial tool to be able to add. But as we saw in JP's Waterworth model, there's a lot of different moving parts. And so you have to be able to see how rates and drought surcharges play with each other to be able to meet our different financial obligations. We also have and if we look at the next slide, Katie, here's a couple of examples of just what water management plans and stages. The normal, we have the water supply, we have 30 months of supply, everything's fine. We don't need to reduce outdoor use, but a stage one where our water supply has dropped, then we need to maybe start, conserving some of those different, those supplies. If we look at the next slide as another example, we can see that sometimes these stages have different goals targeted for the percent of reservoir level to the annual, the acre feet that's being used, or even the gallons per capita per day for our community. These stages can, capture some of that information, but regardless of how those different stages are set up, the challenge is being able to now address or play on the financial side to say, okay, what do our surcharges need to be to still be able to operate, even though some of these reservoirs are low and we're using less water. I wanted to turn some time over to my friend Sanjay. Sanjay, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you, Greg, for inviting me to this panel, and it's great to see you again.
Yeah, no, it's been great. We've done a lot of work, at different times in California. And as a California drought rate expert, I mean, natural disasters like drought, you can't really plan for it. And so there's always that uncertainty. And with California, almost seemingly like you're never hearing that it's really out of a drought. And the whole state's a moderate drought with all of the other issues that are there, Prop 218 and a lot of political struggles there in California. How do you maintain financial resilience during such a high degree of uncertainty?
Well, that's a great question, Greg. And the way I like to position it or talk about it is that you have three approaches. You have the reactive approach, which would be then, okay, I'm going to build up some reserves, something happens, and my financial resilience fee plan, and Glenn's going to maybe faint on me here, is I'm going to reduce my CIP project. And that's my financial resiliency plan. And, and of course, that's a short-term solution, kicking the can down the road, and doesn't really solve anything long-term. And it's just, that liability is going to be there. So that's one approach you could do. The second approach is you can start doing drought rates, and that's planning ahead. You have these things here, and you can start figuring out what's my cost structure, what's my revenue structure, how much revenue do I need to collect during these stages, and then have the appropriate drought rates in place. So when the city council or the board declares stage 3, there's surcharges associated with that, and they come into play. That's another approach. That's planning. That's good. And then the third one, I would call it, is the proactive planning and tool approach. And one of the challenges that I really witnessed in the 2015 drought is how quick that drought occurred. In the sense that, how it played out in 2015, I remember this, is that, it was dry, and we're like, okay, we're hoping for this miracle rain that happened in March, because it did happen before historically. It didn't happen. Then in April, the governor, declared a drought. And then in May, the governor mandated these cutbacks, and they were significant. And I remember talking to my colleagues in the water industry, general managers, and they're all like, there's no way we can meet these cutbacks. They were like 30%, 28%. And guess what? They did. Within a month, people were meeting the cutbacks. And that was mainly because there was a lot of messaging that was happening. People saw the visuals of the Sierra dry as a bone, and they all knew that there should be snow there, and there wasn't. And that had a significant challenge with it. Yeah, let's look at Santa Cruz here. Thank you for showing that, Katie. And let's look at so this is one example here where Santa Cruz actually had that, where it was really quick, and they had to meet this. And because of Prop 218, just because of public outreach, it took a while. If we go to the next slide. So these are just the stages cut back. These are more recent right now. And then the next slide actually shows the rates, and they decided to do it on a fixed charge. There's pros and cons, and today's dialogue isn't too much about drought structures and how to do it, whether it should be on a fixed charge or a commodity or inclining tiers. There's pros and cons with that. Santa Cruz did it as a fix because their water use is so significantly low. They're one of the lowest GPCD in California, and I suspect in the nation. So given how quick the drought can change and how you have to pivot so quickly, it's really important to have a tool in place that can allow you to evaluate different scenarios quickly. There's also co-side here, which we'll skip for now. But so we have these traits right here. And so co-side did it based on stages and based on an inclining tier rate structure. And this they're about to adopt in January. And this is the public notice right here. So the challenge is how to pivot quickly, how to move. So as the drought changes, you're able to see financially how things are in play. Because one of the things with these drought stages is this is sort of when you adopt them, this is sort of the worst case scenario. And what we were hoping for, or city council or the board wants, is that, okay, you declare stage 3. I don't really want to implement these surcharges stage 3. I like to implement stage 1. Can we do that? Can we get away with a stage 1, or can we eat into reserves? And so those policy, that dialogue of pivoting and moving and looking at what if scenarios instantaneously needs to be played, is a crucial tool that's needed.
Now, Sanjay, obviously, if it was a televised council meeting, or say it's a workshop and they're going through different scenarios, a lot of them would say, okay, show me a 20% reduction or a 40% reduction. And, so JP, if I can invite you back to the plate and let's play some of this out. Sanjay, as a drought expert with rates, go ahead and direct that and help interpret some of those different changes that you're seeing off of the model.
Yeah, and so the first thing I just want to make sure, JP brought up the cost structure and revenue structure. So just to remind everyone, their cost structure is 35% variable, 65% fixed. And that's because they buy quite a bit of imported water in this case. Now, every agency is different and unique. And that's sort of the fun thing about working with agencies is, the uniqueness. So you have to look at your agency. Are you groundwater? Then that means you're most likely a lot fixed. You're 100% imported and you have a lot of, it might be even higher than 35.
But if they're in a drought area, they've had to diversify their water supply also, especially in California. So
well, they try.
Yeah.
But sometimes you don't have much choice. I mean, it's just physically you're not there. Santa Cruz would love to diversify, but they only have one source.
Okay.
So ideally that's the goal, is to diversify, but it's hard. Some agencies can't. So that's the cost structure. On the revenue side, as JP mentioned, they're the opposite. So they only collect 35% fixed and 65% variable. And in this ideal world of, I call it rate utopia, financial utopia, your fixed costs would cover your fixed revenue. We all talk about that and everyone's excited about that. But the challenge is that the meter charge would have to go up to around $50 or $60 a month. And if you want to have a good political outcry and a lot of people show up at your board meeting or city council meeting, that's a great way to do it. And with pitchforks and it's not a great scene. So because of that, there's some political pressure of not doing that. So JP, let's play around here. As you mentioned, reserves are healthy on this scenario. Coverage ratios are healthy. So let's do a 20% reduction and see that. And as I can see here, you're doing this on the fly on me. That's sort of sweet.
Yeah, so I'm just going to create a new scenario here so we don't mess around with Greg's baseline. And we'll come into the model, and now you'll tell me what is this. So let's say you're advising Greg on, let's try a scenario. What would you have him try to do to his model, Sanjay?
Well, let's do the first case. Like, you know, we don't know what's happening in 2022. We know that the state's going to mandate something. We're being optimistic. We think the state's going to mandate a 20% reduction. So let's do a 20% reduction in commodity sales. And then let's, you know, we're optimistic. We think a rebound will occur over 3 years. So each year it will be a 7% increase. So we look at that reserves, you know, on the face value, I'm like, hey, we can weather through this. We did a great job building reserves. Sure, you know, in the out years, we're getting below. Is there a way to compare this with the current one, JP?
Yeah, so let's look at comparing the baseline with the new one. And you can see, so this comparison is just doing a difference between the two scenarios. So you can see that in the second scenario, we've lost some commodity revenues. So we've lost about $1 million, almost 1.5 million in the first year, and it's coming back 1.1 million. It doesn't quite fully come back, but you can see that the effect of that without having any response to it is that Greg is going to lose as much as, you know, if we look towards the end of the modeling here, as much as $8 million over the course of time.
So reserves look good. What about coverage ratio? That's always the thing I always worry about.
So if I go back into this screen here, well, sure enough, Sanjay, you're right. Look what happens to his coverage ratio. And that's obvious because he's lost some of the revenues, and we've shown before that he really needed those to stay above his threshold.
And that's one of the challenges that I saw in the drought in 2015. I suspect we may see that again in California and coming up with the drought, is that if you have debt on, I mean, debt's great, interest rates are really low, intergenerational equity. There's a lot of reasons why to do debt, but one of the challenges is this obligation with the coverage ratio, and then you're in technical default and your credit rating, you know, sinks.
Yeah,
so,
when I was a finance director in California and I saw what was happening from the state to our utility fund, I had to slam on spending really fast in the last couple of quarters just to be able to do it. Luckily, I had a reserve fund that I could, you know, bring in some of it, so I wasn't in technical default. But yeah, I just didn't want to go through some of those disclosure issues. And a lot of people don't have that ability to slam on the brakes, or they might not have a debt, ratio reserve already set up, because that takes a very long time to go through that process to do it. So in this model, just because of that debt ratio, we're going to have to do something else.
Correct.
We can't take that hit.
So let's, what if we get rid of the 4 million in 2022? So that's that first bucket, you know, the reactive approach. And, you know, as you can see, it doesn't really help with the coverage ratio. I mean, we still are in technical default. So we can now, you know, we can have this dialogue with elected officials and show them, and also, you know, you see the reserves, because we're still spending that capital project that's significantly needed. You know, we could look at scenarios of delaying that capital project. But for today, let's look at what we put some drought surcharge in play. So let's keep that, you know, that 4 million in, and then let's propose to the board, well, what if we do a $2 million in 2022 and see what happens? And I don't know if you can show me also the coverage ratio too.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah, sure.
And so just starting with the,
yeah, let's just do that, and let's do a little dance. So that works in 2022, but we still have problems in 23 and 24. So that means we need a surcharge, unfortunately. So then let's try to put 1.5 in, and then let's put 750,000 in 24, and see if that sort of solves our problem. And it does. And so, you know, so we can present different scenarios to elected officials about, okay, this is what we think is going to happen. This is the rebound that we anticipate. You know, taking this debt issuance doesn't solve. We could, you know, look at a scenario of deferring CIP and present that and argue why we wouldn't want to do that. And then we would want to make this argument. Now, Glenn, I mean, what's your experience with rebounds? Do you think we're being too optimistic, or?
I do. So when you need to get to that 20% reduction or more, what ends up happening is some people are just going to cut back on their water use a little bit. But I think what other people are going to end up doing, and it was true in my household back in 2007 when we were in a drought here in North Carolina, is I looked around the house and said, okay, what's using the most water? Well, it's the ancient toilet and the ancient shower head. So I replaced them both. And that alone cut the water use by about 25%. Well, when the drought ended, that water use didn't come back. That was gone permanently.
You didn't bring back the ancient toilet?
No, it did not put the ancient toilet back in. So, kept the new toilet, kept the new shower head. Now, I'm not one to often irrigate my yard, but I know some of my neighbors are. And, some of them are in the habit, I think, of watering every single day. Well, now the drought goes into effect. Maybe you're only allowed to water once or twice a day. Some people start to realize, hey, I can actually get by with watering once or twice a day. Or some people can realize, oh my goodness, a brown yard is not the end of the world. I don't need to go back to outdoor irrigation. And so my experience of working with communities, large and small, coming out of a drought is the water use is going to rebound, but it's not going to quite rebound 100%. It'll probably permanently be down, 4 or 5% over time because of the technology upgrades or just the behavioral changes that people have.
So we could actually look at that. I mean, that's a scenario we could look at where instead of doing a 3-year rebound, maybe it's a 5-year rebound of like 3 or 4% each year. And again, we can just sort of play around with that and just see what that does, both on the revenue side and the ending balance. And then let's look at the coverage ratio, which is sort of the, let's do that compare. You're right. Where should we look at that?
So that's gotten a little bit, well, I was going to say it's gotten worse. Greg is still losing money, but don't forget, we've also corrected with some, with the lost commodity revenues, we've corrected with the fixed drought charges. So that's why these orange bars are at the top here. So, so we're seeing that Greg is actually going to gain some cash in the early years, but then because of Glenn's scenario where the recovery was worse than we thought, we might still have to make some further corrections.
Now, personally, when I've implemented surcharges, drought surcharges, sometimes there's that pushback. It's like, wait a minute, we did that on a temporary basis. We're not in a drought stage anymore. The water director changed it, so we're back to normal use, but you're still trying to apply drought surcharges for recovery. At what time does that really go back to normal rates, or do we just keep those drought surcharges out there? Politically, this is always a touchy point.
And that's sort of the big lesson that we learned here in California is that the drought hit, we put these surcharges into play, drought's over, but rebound didn't occur. And we had to keep these surcharges in place financially, and it's an ugly story. And so what I usually recommend is, even though you may not want to do a rate study or a new Prop 218 notice, but that's the time to do it, to incorporate the new lower demand and assume that new and lower demand in your financial plan and have rates that support that, or it's based on that, excuse me. But with this scenario here, as you can see, we scraped by in 2024 with the coverage ratio. And the neat thing here is that, and we can do this another time, but we could do a break-even analysis and ask ourselves, well, how low does demand, what kind of rebound, what's the lowest rebound do we need in order to be fine financially? And then that's a really good information. So as an agency, then as we operate, we can keep an eye on that and see how we're doing. So that's one scenario. I want to do the second scenario, Greg, that you mentioned about the 40%. So, now, that was the optimistic scenario where it's say, hey, let's do a 40%. Well, what if we had to do a 40% reduction and then a 12% rebound in the next 3 years?
Okay, so we're assuming we have the 20% in place and the drought went longer and deeper. So the water director, basically following the water management plan, said, nope, now we're in stage 3 or 4 and it's a 40%.
Yeah, we were hoping it was the stage 2, but
Right.
that spring rain or the spring hot summer
The
came.
runoff did not occur.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or it occurred too fast.
Right. Yeah. Too much water at the wrong place, wrong time.
Exactly. And that's sort of the challenge we're facing. That summarizes it.
So if we go back to this screen, we can see that we're back to, I think, having trouble with our debt service coverage without responding further.
Correct. And so that means we need a even more of a larger surcharge than the ones that we anticipated, maybe a 4 million, a 3 million, and a 1.5. I'm just, based on the magnitude, I'm thinking maybe doubling it. That this is not a fun story to tell, but this is the messaging, the tool to navigate through these challenges that's needed. And then most likely we may want to get rid of that $4 million debt issuance in 2022.
Well, the timing on that would be interesting, because if my experience as a CFO in Colorado is that after years of heavy drought messaging, that the per capita came down so far that I was actually able to adjust some of the engineering planning designs. Therefore, I didn't need the large diameter pipes. I could downsize it a little bit for some of these other reasons. And therefore, I could reduce the capital plan, not just a delay, push it out scenario, but actually reduce the magnitude of order based on the change in demand because of the conservation of droughts.
Exactly.
And of course, we have a problem way out in the future, which we'll probably solve with, instead of some small rate increases you were planning, Greg, they might have to be higher, but that's something we can solve in any number of ways down the road.
Glenn, are you seeing any observations there or?
Yeah, and I think, Greg, it's good that you bring up this idea that if demand does permanently change, it may necessarily change some of the assumptions we've made in the future about the system. And I think you're right. If that means that we end up with lower capital costs in the future, that's a good thing. But I do want to remind folks that if you've gone through the painstaking process of asset management, capital planning, maybe even gotten to a preliminary engineering report, all of those assumptions are now wrong. And you've got to go back to the drawing board and
your
correct
master
them.
plan, yeah.
So, your future capital costs may go down, but your kind of medium-term planning costs may actually go up a bit, and some of the assumptions that you've made may change. So anytime we're looking at a disruption of income, we're talking drought today. Obviously, we've all been living through the pandemic for almost 2 years now. I think the big lesson for me in my years of experience with this is don't assume that when everything is over, you just go back to the way things were before. And you've got to assume change in the future. And it's going to mean having to make a lot of tweaks to all of the very careful planning that you've done for the future of your utility, because all of your assumptions are going to be a little bit wrong now.
Sanjay, one of the thoughts I had was here, a lot of elected officials, they want to get reelected every 4 years. And whenever you talk about rate increases or a change of rates and trying to communicate that, both getting the approval and then communicating that back out to the population, because a lot of those customers, the only interface that they might be having with the utility or the city is that water bill. And that's going to wake up, a lot of the sleeping giants in the community. How do you start addressing and communicating both to, as the finance person, to the elected officials and to the community as a whole to justify these needs? Any lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of one of the, almost the elephant in the room in the water utility is that, in the past we were the unseen provider. That was our mantra. We didn't want it. I mean, sure, we wanted people at our board meeting, not really. And it was great when no one showed up and we just did our job. Rates were low, under $50 a month. and we provided clean, reliable water. Now, with costs increasing, now it's over $100 for some communities. People are noticing it's still a great value. Of course, water is crucial. And so water agencies now have to pivot and talk about the value they provide. And they have to do that before the crisis starts. So it's really important for the finance director to work with the communication people and really start talking about your system and talking, especially if you're a separate entity from the city, or even if you're the city, you have to get playtime with city council, which is challenging because city council has so many other issues they're dealing with. But really start communicating, where's our water from? What's our system like? How old our system? Talk about the things that Glenn talked about. When was the system built? Who paid for it? And why we've been able to have low rates now in the future, set that expectation. And then having a tool, to really communicate, a visual tool with graphics, similar to Waterworth, where you can show instantaneously what's going on in your community and how to address these things, and then really talk about it. And lastly is this dialogue that needs to happen about, is water a commodity? The water service, is it a commodity or is it a service actually, like cable or internet? And most of the people in the water community will say, well, it's both, but we're trying to pivot more towards the service model, in the sense that then we can start having a higher fixed charge and be able to address these risks. But all of this is long-term investments, and it really requires communication. Santa Cruz, when we worked with them, they did extensive public outreach. They have a very active community, maybe a little bit too active, but they have a very, and so we did a lot there, and they had a communication people, and it was intense. But at the end, the city council loved it. They praised the staff for all the outreach that they did. So,
and the outreach and the communication is huge. JP, you have about 100 clients using Waterworth in the U.S. and Canada. How did that visualization actually help during when most people were working remote and still having to deal with these issues and share this decision-making process?
I think that there's other tools out there like this. So we're just looking at Waterworth today, but I think the key, and as Sanjay put it, is just to use visuals. I think it's hard for us as humans to look at walls of numbers and go through reports that can be hard to read. Those just really aren't good communication tools. So what we've found is, and maybe largely because our tool is cloud-based, it's easy to share. And unlike an Excel file, it's not something that our customers can break. They can't add a row, or they can't change a formula in a column. It's just the thing, the structure of the model is there. They can put data in, good data or bad data, but that's as far as they can go. So it really takes that edge off of what they're doing. And because our tool is so visually driven, it's really helping our customers to communicate more effectively, starting with their elected officials, to get them understanding. And it's just leading to better conversations, and they're just ultimately making smarter decisions more efficiently, saving time and effort. Everybody saves time and effort because they're not going around and around, iterating through multiple council meetings or multiple board meetings. They're getting to decisions quicker, so that frees up their time for other things.
Excellent. With that, we're getting close to the end of our hour together here. Katie has a final poll question for us. Let's see. Does your utility have the ability to model overall financial impacts for long-term or short-term revenue loss disasters like drought? So it's a simple yes or no on this one. Wow. Yes. 56%. No. 44%. I guess you're at the right place. And I would, say, there's a lot of different resources here on this panel to be able to kind of reach out and be able to, find out what, how people can support your needs.
Just to wrap it up, just wondering if anyone has any questions. We did have the chat open for any questions throughout the little seminar here, but if anyone has any lingering questions, now is the time to ask as well.
Just Greg, one comment here, given the polling question, this is a good time to start working on this, because I don't think it's too late. I mean, you have this, if the drought's going to occur, it's going to happen most likely in the spring. So you have 3 months or 4
Yes.
months. You know what I mean? You have the holidays here coming up too. But, if you don't have it.
Just like everybody's pandemic plans, you have to, dust it off and say,
Correct.
okay, it's not avian flu, so, we need to update it and go back to it. So I think, how do your financial plans tie back to your water management plans and make sure that it syncs up? Because maybe your initial drought work doesn't cover the revenue that you have now based on the model. Katie, we did have a question. Can we see the results of that first poll question?
Yeah, absolutely.
How prepared are you to recover revenue during a disaster? And that could be any disaster. So 2%, well, very prepared, 19%, so somewhat prepared, 62%. But there's still, that 17% somewhat unprepared. And so we're hoping these dialogues and resources can actually move us up that line so we can all feel a little bit more prepared, considering water is life, and this this is a huge component to successful communities, large and small.
I'm just going to jump in here before everyone signs off the Zoom. If this is something that you would want to have a bit of a deeper conversation about, as it more specifically pertains to your utility, your community, if you are, maybe you're a director of finance or director of public works, and this is part of your role, then I'm going to put this link in the chat right here, and you can book a time with us, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you for no charge. On the other hand, if you are a service provider to a municipality, maybe an engineering firm, something of that nature, where you might be helping these communities build these water plans, or look at how that might impact their rates, you can also reach out to us there and be happy to have a conversation with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and there's everyone's emails as well. If you want to reach out to any of the panelists individually, any questions, follow up, feel free to do so.
With that, I just want to thank all the panel members for joining us, sharing their expertise with us, and JP, wonderful cloud-based online model there. And with that, thank you very much, TV Land. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you all. Thank you, JP, Sanjay.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Sanjay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Happy
Thanks,
holidays.
everyone.